Have you ever heard that Moses might have been a stutterer? Yes, Moses, one of the most well-known biblical figures and the author of the first 5 books of the Bible, also known as the Pentateuch. We know that Moses was chosen by God to lead the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt and into the Promised Land. Given his significant role in biblical narratives, it's natural for people to have various curiosities about Moses' life, and one of those is the possibility that he had a speech impediment. Often, such curiosities stem from our attempts to relate to biblical characters by bringing them closer to our reality. After all, it can be interesting to think that someone like Moses had to face challenges and limitations common to many of us, such as stuttering, speech difficulties, or a speech impediment. But does this theory make any sense? Was Moses really a stutterer? Or is this just unfounded speculation or a fabrication by those who like to go beyond what the Bible says? This is precisely what we will discuss. The idea that Moses was a stutterer comes from specific verses in the book of Exodus, where he expressed concern about his ability to speak. However, it is important to note that the Bible does not explicitly describe Moses as a stutterer. The interpretation that he might have had this condition is actually an inference based on his self-description as slow of speech and tongue. Let's understand this better. The first mention of Moses' speech difficulty appears in Exodus 4:10, where, upon being called by God to lead the liberation of Israel, he responded as follows: "O Lord, I have never been eloquent, neither in the past nor since you have spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and tongue." Indeed, this verse raises questions about the nature of Moses' problem. Most scholars agree that the verse suggests Moses saw himself as unable to speak clearly or persuasively. In other words, he didn't think he could express himself well. However, some have noted that the phrase slow of tongue could indicate a physical speech difficulty, leading to the assumption that Moses might have been a stutterer. But to better understand what Moses meant by claiming to be slow of speech or slow of tongue, it is crucial to consider the broader context of the scriptures. When Moses made this statement, God was calling him to his great mission as the leader of the people of Israel. At the time, Moses made a series of objections to his commissioning, and his difficulty in speaking was just one of them. Interestingly, in the New Testament, the deacon Stephen, in his great exposition of the history of redemption before the Sanhedrin, described Moses in the Egyptian setting as someone mighty in words and deeds. See what Stephen said about him in Acts 7. At that time, Moses was born, and he was no ordinary child. For 3 months he was cared for by his family. When he was placed outside, Pharaoh's daughter took him and brought him up as her own son. Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in speech and action. By describing Moses as powerful in words and deeds, Stephen depicted him as someone who spoke and acted with authority, a description similar to that applied to the Lord Jesus Christ in Luke 24:19. In fact, before his flight to Midian, Moses had grown up in Pharaoh's court, where he would have received a high-level education, including communication skills. Therefore, some commentators use Stephen's description to argue that it is unlikely the phrase slow of speech refers to a speech impediment such as stuttering. Perhaps Moses' objection was more related to his perception of personal inadequacy and the lack of eloquence he believed he had developed after many years in the desert. In fact, later in Exodus 6:12, Moses again expressed his concern, referring to himself as having uncircumcised lips. This expression can be translated as lips that speak with difficulty, or even impure lips, similar to what the prophet Isaiah mentioned in Isaiah 6:5. The exact meaning Moses intended by using this expression is difficult to determine. Thus, many scholars suggest that the main issue in Moses' claim of being slow of speech and tongue was not a physical speech impediment, such as stuttering, but rather a lack of confidence in his communication skills, possibly exacerbated by the time he spent away from Egyptian society and the formal training he had received. Indeed, Moses received a complete education in Egypt, but then he spent decades in the desert living the simple life of a shepherd before being called by God for his great mission. Those who adopt this interpretation explain that Moses' frustration in Exodus 4:10 can be compared to the Apostle Paul's description in his second letter to the Corinthians, where he admitted that, for some, his physical presence and speaking ability were considered weak. In other words, he was seen by some as a poor preacher, an insignificant orator. Thus, both Moses's and Paul's cases would indicate a personal perception of inadequacy that did not necessarily reflect the reality of their abilities. But it is important to understand here that Moses' reluctance to accept God's call ultimately indicated a lack of faith. Yes, the main issue was not Moses' supposed stutter, but his lack of faith. By focusing on his own limitations, Moses took his attention away from the power of God, who was calling him to a specific task. This excessive concern with his personal abilities ended up being a mistake that he repeated in his other objections to God's call, such as when he questioned his leadership ability and the receptiveness of the Israelites. However, God did not correct Moses for his self-assessment, but for his lack of trust in the divine plan. The Lord's response to Moses' lack of eloquence and slow of tongue was as follows: "Who gave human beings their mouths? Who makes them deaf or mute? Who gives them sight or makes them blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go, I will help you speak and will teach you what to say." Doesn't it seem unbelievable? Moses was trying to use his mouth, his tongue, as an excuse to decline his mission, but he was doing this before the one who created human speech. Despite this response from the Lord, Moses continued to insist that God send someone else in his place. God had already left Moses without excuses, but he kept trying to reject the divine choice, which caused the Lord's anger to burn against him. The Bible text clearly records that the Lord's anger burned against Moses. Nevertheless, Moses' excuses did not thwart God's purpose. God had prepared Aaron, Moses' brother, who spoke fluently, to be his spokesman. The dynamic between Moses and Aaron would be similar to the relationship between a prophet and the Lord. Prophets were those who officially communicated God's will to the people, and although Moses felt inadequate, God would provide the necessary means for his will to be fulfilled. Yes, Moses might have been a stutterer or had some other difficulty affecting his public speaking, but none of this would have been an insurmountable obstacle to his mission. And here, I want to draw your attention to the fact that it is not important whether Moses was a stutterer or not. As we've seen, the Bible does not categorically state that Moses was a stutterer, and the term used in the Hebrew text of Exodus 4:10 is not conclusive on this point, being open to various interpretations, as explained here. The text might simply indicate Moses' lack of confidence in his public speaking ability, possibly due to a lack of practice or experience in communication before large crowds, something understandable considering he had spent many years tending flocks in the desert. However, the most relevant aspect of this story is the emphasis on divine provision to overcome any human limitation. Moses' life is proof that God equips and takes responsibility for those he calls, regardless of their perceived weaknesses. Whether Moses was a stutterer or simply insecure in his speech doesn't matter. What matters is that God chose to use him in a powerful way, demonstrating that the effectiveness of God's servant does not depend on natural abilities, but on the divine power that sustains them. This story reminds us that God can use our limitations to reveal his glory, and that obedience to the divine call is more significant than our personal insecurities. Moses, despite his own reservations, was the leader whom God used to accomplish one of the greatest works in biblical history, showing that when we trust in the Lord, he transforms our weaknesses into instruments of his eternal purpose. As I often say in various videos on this channel, God fulfills his purposes through us and despite us. This is what we see in Moses' story. God fulfilled his plan through Moses and despite Moses. Even if Moses had been a stutterer, God's plan was fulfilled. Even if Moses' claim of not being able to speak well was just an excuse to escape the divine call, God's plan was fulfilled. In this sense, we can draw 3 practical lessons for our lives. First, we must place our trust in God, not in our abilities. Moses felt inadequate for the mission God gave him. Many of us may feel the same way when we are called to serve God, and we often point to our weaknesses as excuses. However, just as God assured Moses that he would help him speak and teach him what to say, we must trust that God will equip us to fulfill his purpose, even in areas where we feel most incapable. Our trust should be in God's power and provision, not in our own abilities. Second, we must respond with obedience to the Lord's call. We have discussed that Moses' reluctance to accept the divine call reflected a lack of faith and trust in God. This example teaches us the importance of immediate obedience when God calls us to a mission. When we focus on our own limitations, we can lose sight of what God can do through us. Therefore, we must respond to God's call with faith and obedience, knowing that He is with us and will equip us to fulfill His plan. And finally, third, we must understand that God transforms our weaknesses into instruments of His glory. Yes, Moses' story shows that God uses even our weaknesses to fulfill His purposes. The Apostle Paul also needed to understand this when he repeatedly asked the Lord to remove a thorn in the flesh that afflicted him. However, the answer Paul received from the Lord was transformative. "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." Upon hearing the Lord's response, the apostle realized that his weaknesses were not obstacles to God's work. On the contrary, they were opportunities for God's grace to be demonstrated with greater power. It is precisely in this context of human frailty that God's power manifests most evidently. So we must know that whatever our limitations, God can turn them into opportunities to manifest His glory. This challenges us to see our weaknesses not as insurmountable obstacles, but as ways in which God can show His power. It is not our capabilities or skills that determine the success of our mission in God's work, but the grace and power of the Lord working in and through us. Therefore, instead of running away from or lamenting our limitations, we should see them as part of God's plan for our lives. We must trust that just as God worked with Moses and Paul, He can also use our limitations to advance His kingdom on earth and glorify His name. So a discussion as small as whether Moses was a stutterer or not can draw our attention to a central truth and a truly important lesson: the sufficiency of God's grace, which enables us to overcome any human limitation, equipping us to fulfill the divine purpose even when we feel insufficient. In other words, what we learn here is that the effectiveness of our life and ministry does not depend on our strength, but on the powerful grace that works in and through us. Now, write in the comments your opinion. Do you think Moses was a stutterer or not?